right. So, interestingly, the live option has disappeared for Facebook because they obviously don't want me speaking about a lot of the things that I've been speaking about. At any rate, going back to my essential claim, to reiterate, basically it was that I discovered an equation in 1979, now known as Jacobson resonance, represents the unified field equation that Stephen Hawking knew must exist but didn't find himself. It describes the causal nexus of natural phenomena from the toilings of stars to the spin-angular momenta of leptons and baryons. That is, it describes the interactions of the macroscopic world as well as the microscopic world, from the very large to the very small, with applicability to healthcare, energy, as well as a whole host of eclectic considerations. Now, just to retrace some of the steps, I can't do everything in one explication, but just to retrace some of the steps, as you may recall, I said that I sent papers to Israel, Italy, and Great Britain after being rejected by the National Cancer Institute in America. Italy accepted me immediately. Israel proposed a very apologetic rejection, and Great Britain was courteous in their rejection. This was around 1985, 5 or 6 years post-discovery, actually. Then I mentioned that about 5 years later, I was finally published by the Journal of Theoretical Biology after Professor Yamanashi convinced the chief editor that the paper was very important. Now, interestingly as well, I sent a paper to the International Journal of Neuroscience in around 1990, and the associate editor called and said, "How did you know?" And I said, "What do you mean? How did you know what?" "How did you know that picotesla magnetic fields could treat epilepsy and Parkinson's disease?" And I said, "I'm the one who discovered it in 1979. And he told me that the Greeks were doing it. They had finally started to do it in 1989, 10 years post my discovery. I had sent information to Greece, an abstract for a cancer conference, and also those particular scientists followed Pan Minerva Medica, which was the journal of the Italian Medical Association, also known as Europa Medica. So they read my papers and tried it, and they claimed that it could attenuate seizure activity in epilepsy. And they published their paper in the International Journal of Neuroscience. Now, the chief editor of the International Journal of Neuroscience was attacked kind of by an editorial commentary made by the journal Science. So he traveled to Greece, and he learned that it was in fact true, that picotesla range magnetic fields did in fact attenuate seizure activity in epileptic patients. So then there was this back and forth between the two journals. But the fact of the matter is that the neurologist who worked for the journal had a small device built and was treating patients in Long Island. Well, I let him know that the fact of the matter is that, I'm the one who discovered it. I promulgated it. And the Greeks, in particular Photios and Enos, who is a wonderful physicist, and was using the squid to measure the magnetic profiles of brains, he sent back those fields, and lo and behold, it worked. Okay, so now there was the beginnings of scientific evidence, clinical evidence, that my projection as to the importance of low-level electromagnetic fields was critically important. Now, interestingly, and I'll jump over a few things, in 1995 or thereabouts, Israel did publish a paper that I had sent them and called it a special article, and it was published in the Israel Journal of Medical Sciences. So they came around, and I also published another paper with Cambridge Medical Publications around the same time. So it was starting to open up 15, 16 years later. You have to be patient when you're dealing with change in science. Not to say that the change has not, actually been actualized yet. To some extent it has been, to some extent it hasn't been. At any rate, the important point is that in 1996, I was able to start a public company. So I was given some money for research. And what I did was I called the National Institute of Health to find out who was doing research in AIDS with electromagnetism. And one name came up above everybody else, and that was Bridge Saxena. And Bridge Saxena was professor of reproductive endocrinology, the director of reproductive endocrinology at Cornell Medical School, which is today known as the Weill Medical College of Cornell University. It's in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So I contacted Professor Saxena at that time because I finally had some money for research, and I also had connected to the Mississippi Enterprise for Technology at the John C. Stennis Space Center, which is one of the 12 NASA installations. And I was able to convince individuals there, as well as a couple of NASA engineers, to build my first prototypes. Actually, Professor Yamanashi built the first 7-footer at the University of Oklahoma and sent it to Stennis Space Center, where they made some additions and characterized it. And they also completed the first 18-incher. These are Helmholtz coils that create the magnetic fields calculated by the Jacobson resonance equation. Okay, so I sent papers to Professor Saxena, about 30 or 40 papers, publications. And he read them, and he called, and he said, let's meet. So I flew up to New York, and I met with Bridge Saxena, and Bridge told me in his quest to find scientists who were involved in cutting-edge research, applying physics to medicine, I was the only one that made sense to him. So we began a collaboration. And this was the beginning of um, neuroscience research at Cornell. Now, the first thing we did was he cut pieces of sciatic nerve of mice, and half of the pieces he put in the field, and the other half served as the control. He left out of the field. But both sections were placed in the incubator and maintained at particular temperatures and so on. And the relevance is that I was given approximately 20 different targets relative to nerve regeneration: calmodulin, neurofilaments, microtubules, brain-specific fodrin, any number of nerve growth factor, various growth factors. I made a number of calculations, and I gave Bridge a protocol with 15 or 20 signal sets. So, half the nerves were exposed to magnetic fields and the other half wasn't. And one day, Bridge called me, and he sounded excited like a child. Jerry, you wouldn't believe what happened. Bridge, I think I know what happened. Jerry, the sections of the nerve that were exposed to magnetic fields not only were maintained in terms of their integrity, but they grew longer and thicker. Probably because there was some residual growth factor. Whereas the nerves, the sections that were not exposed to magnetic fields, simply derogated. They simply denigrated. They rotted. And he said, "This is amazing. It's never been done before. It's just remarkable." And we repeated that experiment, only to find the same result. At which time we decided to go into an in vivo study. So I managed to raise some money, also with my foundation, Perspectivism. And we gave it to Angelise Saxena, and she conducted the experiment at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Basically, we exposed the mice in their drinking water to a neurotoxin, IDPN, and their function was reduced to about 40%, and there were marked structural problems in terms of their ultrastructure. The mitochondria were inactive. The myelin sheaths were distorted. The lamellar structure of the myelin was being eaten away. Microtubules and neurofilaments were disrupted. The Golgi bodies were indistinct, which were present in Schwann cells. And Golgi bodies are the source of nerve growth factor. So from an ultrastructural point of view, under the electron microscope, there was disintegration of the nerves. And we were looking at the radial nerves in the forelimb. Now there was, after poisoning, half the mice that were poisoned were exposed to magnetic fields. Of course, there was a control group that was not poisoned. The poisoned, unexposed group continued to deteriorate. The poisoned, treated group, from an ultrastructure point of view, regenerated. Myelin became restored. The mitochondria were restored in activity. The neurofilaments and microtubules were then more distinct. Golgi bodies were clearly evident in Schwann cells that were normalized. And the functionality returned to about 90% of what it should have been relative to the control. So we published this data in Medical Hypotheses, in which I also wrote a theoretical explanation in some detail. Now, the interesting part of this was that Bridge and I went to Pisa, Italy, to a Gordon conference on aging, and I presented the data there. The next day, Bridge and I were having breakfast, and this guy comes over and he introduces himself and he says that he works with the National Institute of Aging, and he says, "You guys were playing a joke on the conferees, weren't you?" And we look at him in shock. "What do you mean, a joke?" And he said, "Well, the so-called treated sections, they were actually the control, weren't they?" And he kind of smirks a little bit. And Bridge Saxena was a very professional man. He was very controlled, very smart. And he was totally affronted, because he never cheated in anything in his life. And why would we travel to Italy to present data that was a joke? So it was an absurdity that many of the conferees simply didn't believe what we were showing them. They didn't believe their own eyes. It was analogous to the time when Galileo supposedly dropped two objects from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, one heavier than the other, and they both hit the ground at the same time. And the professors, the onlookers, didn't believe their eyes. They didn't believe that the heavier object didn't fall faster. This is just the way it is in science, scientific skepticism. Faith, do it.
She's annoying
you? Yeah.
Okay.
I can't concentrate. So, that was one example of scientific skepticism. I was talking to a gentleman yesterday from Canada, and he said when a discovery is bigger, the bigger the discovery is, the more powerful the business could be, the greater the resistance is from a business point of view. And this is just simply true. Because the flow of money and power is the most relevant aspect of anything to the rich and powerful. There was a time when we, Bridge, Saxena, and I traveled to India um, with our wives, Deborah and Angeline. And the objective was to do a lecture tour of India from New Delhi to Bombay to Madras to Calcutta to Lucknow and then back to New Delhi. At that time, I was introduced to the top scientists in the country, physicists, medical doctors, researchers. And I lectured through the Apollo hospital chain, winding up in Calcutta to lecture to the Indian Medical Association. And the difference was incredible because there was a great appreciation for the data. In Calcutta, and of course, I did publish with the Indian Medical Association as well as the Chinese Medical Association. I'm not having any difficulty publishing with those other countries that cover, more than 1 billion people each. Yet America is, America represents the most difficult of the platforms. And European leaders follow the opinion leaders in America, generally speaking. In 1992, I believe it was, I was invited by Bjorn Nordstrom to present a lecture in Stockholm at the City Conference Center to the Oncologic Society of Sweden. And there were 20 or 30 Chinese doctors there because they were following Bjorn Nordstrom's electrochemical treatment for cancer. And I gave my talk, and Bjorn introduced me to the current president of the Nobel Committee as an important physicist. I appreciated that very much. The most important outcome of that conference was not actually research that was stimulated in America. The most important outcome was based upon the fact that a German scientist who had been following me at different conferences came over to me and said, "Jerry, why don't you explain your equation so that people can understand it?" And I said, "I just did." And I thought I made it very simple, very clear. And he said, "No." And he said to me, I asked Brian Josephson what he thought of Jacobson resonance. And Josephson was a Nobel laureate in physics. And Josephson said, "I don't understand it." He didn't say I don't agree with it. He didn't say it's wrong. He just said I don't understand it. And the difficulty was I didn't understand why they had trouble understanding it. But, later learned that from a conceptual point of view, not a mathematical point of view, but from a conceptual point of view, there is some difficult, there is a difficult notion involved. Because when I talk about something at rest on the earth, the average physicist thinks of it as being at rest. But it isn't. Everything's always moving. I've made this point before. When I went to Gordon Conference in New Hampshire in 1986, my first roommate was Bruce McLeod. And Bruce came in. He was all excited. He was doing research on cyclotron resonance and biological systems with Abe Liboff. And, I agreed with him that cyclotron resonance was relevant in biological systems. At any rate, the following morning, I was talking to Bruce and I mentioned that everything in the universe is moving in a spiral path, in a rosette path. And after he heard me say that, he changed his room. he couldn't fathom what I was talking about. Because when you look at something and it appears to be standing still, then you think of it as standing still. But there is no such thing, because everything that is ostensibly standing still is still moving consistently in relative translational motion with respect to whatever else is involved, so that the perceiver, while moving in relative translational motion with that which appears to be standing still, neither one of you is standing still. The perceiver is moving too, with the Earth, as the Earth hurtles through outer space at 18.5 miles a second. Nutating also, bobbing up and down, spinning around. The only reason we don't notice it is because we're doing the same thing. In other words, the perceiver is doing exactly the same thing as the perceived. So you don't notice it. And our brains are wired in such a way so that, we don't get dizzy from it. That's amazing in itself. Think about that. We're sitting on a planet which is rotating at 1,000 miles an hour. That's pretty fast. And at the same time, the planet is bobbing up and down and moving at 18.5 miles per second through space around the sun in some elliptical manner, and we don't notice it. Think about that. Our brains are wired in such a way so that we don't notice it. That's remarkable. Just that degree of perfection requires a creator. It's very simple. At any rate, we were very well received throughout India. Now, Bridge and I also went to Moscow, and I lectured in Moscow. Now, the interesting story about Moscow is that Bridge's wife lectured for 2 hours, presenting the data from the mice study, and I lectured for an hour on the theory. And it appeared that the Russians agreed with me. They understood the relevance of weak magnetic field interactions. This was very important because the Russians are excellent physicists, and so are the Indians excellent physicists and mathematicians. So, after I finished my lecture, there was a top American physicist on the stage, and he turned to me and he said, "How could a picotesla magnetic field do anything?" And I said, "I just explained it." And he said, "How could a picotesla magnetic field do anything? It's too weak." And I said, "Well, I just explained it. Did you ever try it?" And he said, "No." Kind of turned red when he said no. And I said, "Try it, and you'll find out that it works. These magnetic fields are just natural, they're physiologic, and they're a kind of quantum gravity relative to biological systems, especially human beings." So right after that, I'm now sitting in the audience, and the chairman of the Russian delegation is speaking. He's agreeing with me. He's agreeing that these weak magnetic fields are powerful, that they can do all kinds of things, and that the Russian physicists understand me. All of a sudden, an electrical engineer from America says, come on, what are you talking about? I should worry about the light bulb emitting electromagnetic fields? I'm sitting in electromagnetic fields coming from the light bulb. And he starts laughing. I didn't hear too much laughter when he made that so-called joke. But then all of a sudden, the representative from the World Health Organization stood up and he turned to the Russian chairman and he said, stop talking about this. If you expect to get the $100 million grant, shut up. And the Russians shut up on a dime. And I was in shock because this guy from the WHO, he said this in front of everyone, as if to say, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. This is the way it is, and don't argue with me. Don't mention it again. Just shut up, or else, you'll be punished by the power structure. It happened. Actually saw it. He had the nerve, the audacity to actually say it in front of everybody. But that's the way it is. That's just the way it is. And that's in keeping with the lobbyists and how they convinced the federal court to let the patent examiners know that utility has to be demonstrable by an objective third party when it comes to plasma physics and fusion power. So they're not going to give patents to people even if the examiner believes that there's potential in the demonstration of thermonuclear fusion power. The reason this is so important is because it monopolizes the funding sources in such a manner so that it becomes very difficult to get funding from independent sources for research in this area. As my friend in Canada said, the more powerful, the more encompassing the change from a business point of view, a scientific discovery may be, the more resistance it must meet. But this is not sensible. If the human race is to succeed as a species, we have to consider what's true, what's real. We have to think about how to save the integrity. But business is business. And as lawyers say, it is what it is. So I grew old and tired. And I did all that I could. And there's more. There's a lot more. I'll save it for another day. But this painting behind me of the Oriental boy, it represents how I thought and how I felt 50 years ago. I painted that in 1970. It was a long time ago. And I'd show it because it was my mother's favorite painting. So we'll talk more about the trials of making a discovery and trying to bring it to the attention of the world. And we'll also talk about my experience as a musician and an artist, because in meeting all the different kinds of people, I've established certain opinions about the possibility of human ascendance. We'll talk about it. Okay. Hey. Hey.